Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this forum. This is from the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute. Those of you who haven't visited us in our new quarters at the American Foreign Policy Council should do so on Capitol Hill. We're 5 minutes from the Senate side of the Capitol, which enormously increases our interaction with not only members of Congress in both parties and both houses, but with their staff, which is created right at this moment, for reasons you'll hear this morning. This turns out to be a very valuable asset. Now, let me say the obvious, that there are dramatic changes occurring in Uzbekistan and indeed in the region as a whole. And 2 months ago, Svante Cornell, who is right here, the director of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, and Mamuka Tsereteli, back there, no relation either to the sculptor or to Stalin's friend, the three of us decided to undertake a kind of comprehensive study of what's going on in Uzbekistan. And there are so many dimensions of this that we decided to focus really on the legislative acts and the acts that are brought about through administrative fiat, in the normal decision-making process, and to be as comprehensive about that as possible. So we engaged I think, very impressive team of people, and you're hearing from the first of them this morning, Richard Weitz. We will all then go on and have a similar presentation like this on the economy. That will be coming on in just a few weeks. And we will issue those two as separate Silk Road papers. And then coming in fast succession are chapters on the governance, on rights, on religion, and on the foreign reception, how the world has reacted to these changes. Now, we're modest about what we're doing. We don't claim to be saying this is where Uzbekistan or this is where Central Asia is going. What we wanted really was to provide a kind of comprehensive baseline so that in a year from now, 2 years from now, 5, 10 years from now, you could go back to this book, and it will be presented as a book entitled Uzbekistan's New Face, that when this book is available, anyone seeking to evaluate the extent to which these legislative acts or administrative decisions have actually been applied will be able to work from the basis of this book. And by the way, one of the things which we're just say as almost as a teaser, and it's been a very interesting surprise to me, is to discover how much was going on unreported in the West prior to the death of Mr. Karimov. After all, Mr. Mirziyoyev was prime minister for 13 years, and he had his signature projects in those years, largely unreported here, especially in the areas of human rights and so on, which we'll be covering. You'll see in the paper that Musa Sever is writing for us. That's been a very interesting surprise, and I think it has something to do with the question is what is the durability of these reforms? You know, what are their chances of surviving and being implemented successfully? These are all questions which obviously we want to address in the future, but to do so we felt we all needed a comprehensive view of what's actually being done now. And the first of these views I'm honored to present is from Richard Weitz, our old and good friend. He's not that old. Old enough. And this is appearing in a Silk Road paper. We have some copies of it here. And it is online. And so if you go to Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and Google Mr. Weitz, you will find this. And then we're going to have a brief comment from John Herbst, former ambassador to Uzbekistan, and I have to say one of the most successful. And John is now, as you know, at the Atlantic Council, biding his time there dividing it between Ukraine, which takes all his time, and Central Asia, which takes all his time. So there you are, Richard, and then John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. I know that today's situation is even more complicated than usual with the government shutdown. I can tell that helps with Herbst's attendance. I guess it depends on how exempt you are and so on. Is it okay?
I think you must be closer to the mic.
So speak closer to the mic.
Yes.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, and I hope what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an outline of the key points of
Richard, your microphone.
key points of the paper. I have to be able to read the notes, so I think this will work. But I'm really hoping this will be a discussion, since there are just a couple of caveats. This was a very rapidly produced publication, so I would have liked to spend a couple of years researching it, but we only had a couple of months. I do not know Uzbek, so I had to rely primarily on Russian and English sources. I benefited a lot of help from some of my interns. Some of them come from the region. One was an Uzbek national, so she helped me with the resources, and some of them from neighboring countries. So I was able to make up for some of the deficiencies in my language skills and time that way. But I also see this primarily as a work in progress. I think a lot of the questions for this and the other papers are going to be, by necessity, unanswered since we've only had a year or so. And of course, a lot of the initiatives in foreign policy don't depend on the Uzbek government itself. It depends on how the other governments respond, which are reacting, as well as regional developments, many of which are unpredictable. The key points I'd like to make are that we've certainly seen a major change in tone, the whole approach towards the world, conception of Uzbekistan's status, role, and goals, particularly on the regional level, which is very different than what we saw in the previous administration. However, there are elements of continuity, at least in terms of long-term goals between the Karimov and administrations, particularly stress on national autonomy, maximizing Uzbekistan's flexibility, and so on. So changes in declaratory policy, changes in tactics, but a lot of persistence at the level of goals. And so I'm going to go through and talk about, organize my presentation by looking at various regional issues. It's mostly, the text and my comments are mostly focused on security. I don't know economics as well, but I think looking at the audience list, a lot of people here know that issue very well. And there'll be, of course, separate papers on this in the series that will be presented in as a book. The challenges facing Uzbekistan and opportunities, of course, have changed just over the past year. The challenges are transnational terrorism, contested access boundaries, access to regional resources, particularly water, economic challenges from a region that is somewhat isolated from Asia, Europe, North America, or other centers of the world economy. It's a tough neighborhood. It's trying to allow nuclear powers. Sometimes the great powers, external powers, are too active in the region that you would like to see if you were in Central Asia. Sometimes they're not active enough, and I often hear that criticism of American foreign policy. And so Uzbekistan has tried to manage these challenges, as well as the opportunities that it presents itself from being the largest country in terms of population, pivotal location, be surrounded by the other Central Asian countries, plus Afghanistan, which many experts would consider part of the region. And not bordering Russia, China, and has therefore having perhaps a little more room to maneuver with the buffer states in between. I think that what I would most emphasize in current initiatives has been a real strong emphasis on Central Asian solidarity, the importance of cooperating with other Central Asian governments to address these common transnational challenges, be them international terrorism or contested boundaries or lack of need to share water and electricity resources and so on. In water area, you've seen this in particular on a softer tone towards the effort by neighboring countries, particularly Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, to concentrate hydropower. As you know, the challenge for the region has been that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan use shared water resources primarily for agricultural irrigation, whereas Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan use it primarily for hydroelectric power generation. And under the Soviet Union, they can enforce a common system. And when that broke apart, you've seen differences between the countries of what to emphasize. And the prior government under Karimov sometimes took a very hard stand on some of the dam projects in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Whereas I think the new government has been much more open to looking for a common solution while still protecting Uzbek interests, in particular talking about shared projects, shared energy. There's been a recent agreement, as far as media says, with respect to Kyrgyzstan about how you could maybe have resolve some of the issues over a disputed reservoir. And so this is a good opportunity for other countries like the US and the UN, well, the international UN and the EU to help address this water issues. It doesn't take a lot of resources from our point of view. It takes basically some good diplomacy and a cooperative win-win attitude. In terms of dealing with the challenges by international extremism, clearly the challenge is there. It changes over time. Originally the challenge of the Islamic group in Uzbekistan, and Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS, it probably varies in degree and location. It's still not clear to what extent all these groups are active in different places, but they clearly have ambitions for the region. And what we've seen here is changes in both domestic policy and foreign policy. Domestic policy, there's been an effort to re-incorporate people that have perhaps strayed waywardly in Islamic extremism in the past, perhaps work on promoting an enlightened vision of Islam, going back to the long, benign tradition of the Muslim faith in the region. In the international level, we've seen cooperation with neighboring countries and with globally through the UN and other partnerships. Mostly this has been level of intelligence sharing and talking about keeping foreign fighters that perhaps have Uzbek connections from returning. As you know, there have been some incidences in Russia, Europe, and the US of Uzbek nationals involved in terrorism, but most of those people left Uzbekistan a long time ago or were radicalized elsewhere. So the concern is more about people who maybe left more recently and fighting in Syria and now might try and come back. And you've also seen reforms to the national armed forces, new defense agreements, including with Russia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. And continuing U.S. presence, Central Command is still engaging with the government so they can have limited training. In terms of some other transnational challenges, human trafficking, narcotics trafficking, there's been efforts, I'll talk about the Afghanistan approach next, but in terms of the human trafficking, some of the human rights issues, child labor, there's some other papers that will focus on this, but I do see, at least at the declaratory level, a desire of the government to make progress in these areas, and some human rights groups commenting there's been some improvements, there's still challenges in implementation, they'd still like to see more. But they all affirm an interest in working with the current government to make further progress in this area. In terms of Afghanistan, that's another area I think that's seen a remarkable difference. The previous administration often described Afghanistan as something of a challenge. There was a work on working through regional 6+3 framework that was the Afghan government role be limited in a broader regional framework trying to address the Afghan security issues. The current government is much more open about working with the current Afghan government. You've had visits at the official level for the first time in many years. You've seen new projects about extending transportation nodes, electricity. You've seen discussion of joint security commission, joint border efforts on security. And we've just seen just a different tone at the bilateral level, much more positive about how Afghanistan and Uzbekistan can work to promote their mutual security and economic interests. And this is also extended at the regional level through the Office of the UN Regional Center and other bodies. But the government is also, the Uzbek government has also been very consistent about saying that the Afghan peace process is led by and should be primarily done by the Afghan themselves, strictly an Afghan government-led process. In terms of other regional organizations, it hasn't been that much of a focus in the past year. Most of the effort has been on the bilateral level with key countries. There has been some new developments. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Uzbek government was happy to see India and Pakistan elevate full status, not least because of the potential that would have to make progress on the Afghan issue. There have been efforts to work with the EU on economic issues, but also reform issues. The EU said it was happy that the government is committed to make reforms and is eager to work with the government as it implement business, labor, judicial, administrative changes. The other regional organizations, NATO, not much of a change there. Clearly no movement back towards NATO bases, or kind of close cooperation we saw a while ago, but also not the period of confrontation that we've had. So it's more, NATO itself is not that heavily engaged with Central Asia, but this may increase as NATO increases its involvement in Afghanistan. And same with the Moscow-led institutions in the region, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. There's been this declaration that Uzbekistan will continue the policy of not joining these organizations. Maybe the current efforts have been focused more on the Commonwealth of Independent States, but it's a little unclear in multi-territory how that will evolve. So some changes in regional structure, but a lot less so than in terms of the bilateral relations. I'm going to go into each of those now in a little detail. The relationship with Kazakhstan has probably changed the least, but that's also not too remarkable, since the relationship was pretty good even before the change of government in Uzbekistan. There's sometimes rivalry between the two countries. For the most part, though, they've gotten along well in recent years. They've been on the same side with respect, for example, to the question of how to use the shared water resources. There's also been an effort to work on within some regional structures. There's good trade and so on, but not as much the change in the other three countries. With respect to Kyrgyzstan, I think that we've seen some really large changes. We've seen leadership visits at the level of the presidents. We've seen resolution of delineation of much of the 1,300-kilometer border. I think one is about 85%. As I said, we've seen progress on the hydrocarbon area, the hydropower area, and an effort by both countries to try and build trade and economic ties further, increase transit, also at the level of popular level, easing of visa restrictions, opening of new cross-border connections, and trying to draw both countries into the larger transportation networks, such as the railway being built by China. And these ties have extended beyond just the presidential and prime minister level. They involve people, officials at the lower level, provincial level, and so on. So that seems to be a major change in actual policies as well as territory. With Tajikistan, again, the key issue here is probably relaxation of the previously severe dispute over damming. There's been a resumption of direct commercial flights. There's been no return to some of the trade and economic constraints that Uzbekistan put on Tajikistan at various points over time related to that dispute. There have been increased travel, and I think the Prime Minister recently visited Tajikistan. I think the result was they're going to go relax the visa requirements for UK visits. With Turkmenistan, that relationship has always been okay. I mean, they cooperate together on supplying energy to China. They both were outside some of the Russian-led regional structures. But you did have the first foreign trip of the Uzbek president to Turkmenistan. And looking forward, I think we might see a lot of that relationship expand much further, since there's some interest in working together on joint natural gas pipelines, joint electricity projects. For the moment, they haven't reached fruition yet because of Afghanistan and other challenges, but they could improve over time. In terms of the level of beyond the region, with respect to Russia, that relationship began to improve even under Karimov. I think that's continued. We had a successful visit in April. I think Russia has returned as Uzbekistan's leading trade and partner as of later data. There have been a somewhat new initiative. They had their first joint exercise recently. There's been a signing of military technical cooperation agreements. But again, the Uzbek government was reaffirmed its commitment not to join the CSTO or host foreign bases or send its troops abroad. China, China-Uzbek relationship was already developing economically. That has continued. I think that the current Uzbek government sees an opportunity within China's Belt and Road Initiative to really make a lot of progress in putting Uzbekistan as a pivotal link between China, Europe, and the countries in between, given its location, given opportunities to develop its infrastructure and so on. I mentioned the Chinese-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbek-Afghan railway might be making progress. The Uzbek officials have said they're very interested in getting high technology zones, are interested in developing other joint projects. The question here, of course, is always what extent a lot of the declarations that have been made by the Chinese side actually get themselves to the ground, to what extent they involve Uzbek managers as opposed to Chinese managers brought in and so on. But in principle, you can see the kind of win-win that both governments said they want to see. With the U.S., that relationship appears to be improving. I think that the Uzbek side has said that their relations become particularly strong in the past year on several areas. The Uzbeks seem to be open to engaging with U.S. officials on human rights, on corruption issues, on some of the problems of population in the past. There's always been a strong partnership on countering weapons of mass destruction. And this is continuing. There's work on dealing with common biological health threats, particularly tuberculosis. The two governments most recently have been working on how to enhance cooperation with respect to Afghanistan. Now the Trump administration has made a commitment to that region. The business opportunities are growing still, no match, of course, to the China and Russian involvement, but that might increase given the Trump administration focus on expanding foreign economic ties. As I said, the U.S. military Central Command is eager to work with Uzbekistan, strengthen border and other regional security. The December 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy says that the Trump administration for Central Asia wants to make these countries resilient against domination of rival powers, from becoming jihadi safe zones, and to promote reforms. And all those are would come from further engagement as both countries see them. The challenge here, of course, is that the U.S. always does not put as many resources into these efforts as I think it should, or compared to other countries. So the U.S. will have to rely a bit on creative diplomacy, working with other partners, which I don't have time to go into, but India is a possibility, South Korea, there are other countries engaged in this process. But I think in the interest of time, we can stop here and deal with those in the discussion session.
Thank you very much. This is a very tempting overview, and each paragraph that you provided us leads out to several roads that maybe some of which we will follow in the subsequent discussion. Ambassador Herbst.
Thank you, Fred, and Richard, that's a wonderful overview of where Uzbekistan is today and where it has been in the recent past. Let me offer you just a few thoughts to put in perspective what we've heard and to understand some of the wellsprings of Uzbek policy. And this may seem strange to say in this crowd, but I'll explain the importance of the region and why we should be involved. First, something that is not well understood by anyone who reads even the blue chip American mainstream media, including foreign policy journals relating to Uzbekistan. This is not a country which is ruled by an all-powerful autocrat. That was the picture painted of the first president, Islam Karimov, and that picture was simply wrong. This is a country that is governed by a cohesive elite. A small elite, but not so small as to be located in one room and in one city. And the policies that were pursued by Karimov and the policies that are now pursued by Mirziyoyev are not something that grow fully in the head of the president of Uzbekistan and then imposed on the country. If you understand that, you understand why there was a quick and completely stable transition. All the rattling you heard in Western circles about instability in Uzbekistan when Karimov goes was that of ill-informed people. Also, and this picks up on something that Fred said, or explains something that Fred said in his introduction, which is that the changes we're seeing in Tashkent today did not simply begin the day that Mirziyoyev took over the office of president as an acting president. They actually began, although very, very subtly, which is the Uzbek way. There's the old Russian expression, Vostok это тонкое дело, the East is a nuanced thing, and that's very much true of Uzbekistan. Second point, probably not needed to say in this room, but I'll say it anyway, because I want to broaden the theme. Central Asia is an important place. It is not some distant location, well, of course it is, from Washington, obscure, unimportant. It is, in fact, the center of the world, right? The great landmass, McKinstry's great landmass, right? The center is actually located somewhere in Uzbekistan. I used to know where it was, I forgot. Not too important, but the basic idea is there. And as the center of this great landmass, who are the neighbors? The second and the third greatest military powers on the planet, the second greatest economy on the planet, at least one other major power in the form of India, one nuclear power and a major power in its own right, although right down in Pakistan, another budding nuclear power, despite the best efforts of the West, regional power Iran. And that, there has been an achievement barely acknowledged, again, including by experts in the West, perhaps especially by experts in the West, achievement of stability in Central Asia over the past 25 years. Were there truly instability in Central Asia, this would be a gigantic vacuum. And we know what happens when gigantic vacuums are surrounded by large powers. They are sucked in. And those large powers can begin to take offense one another. So we have a very strong interest in helping perpetuate and strengthen stability in Central Asia. Uzbekistan's role in this is actually the most critical, something which has not, again, been truly appreciated. Uzbekistan has the advantage of not sharing a border with the great northern neighbor, a source of instability. And that advantage has fostered, although that's not quite the right way to put it, there has grown up in this region over centuries, not decades, a sense of independence, a fierceness of independence, placing this on a very high order. And that, plus the absence of borders with the great northern neighbor, has made Uzbekistan, since 1991, the foremost proponent and guarantor of independence in the region. And we could easily do a lecture on the backing and forthings of Uzbek foreign policy under President Klimov designed to achieve that. And again, if you come back to what I said earlier, that the policies of Uzbekistan are not the figment of the imagination of the one autocrat. You realize that the elite accept this and embrace it. Third point. The United States has a critical interest, even a vital interest, in maintaining the stability of Central Asia, and strengthening the stability of Central Asia. If you look closely at the policy of the Trump administration, as Richard just laid it out, it's actually very similar to the policies of all previous administrations have pursued since the decline, the wonderful decline of the Soviet Union. But, and this I think demonstrates the uniqueness of the new administration, they put up top stability, and they link that, properly so, geopolitically smart, with keeping this area stable and having the relationship with the neighboring great powers necessary to ensure stability. If the region truly fell into chaos, it can become a flashpoint between great powers threatening nuclear war. I'm not predicting that, I'm just explaining how the world works and how this could play out. So we have a very clear critical interest in making sure that that does not happen. And maintaining close relations, appropriately close relations, not minimizing differences where they are important, but maintaining close relations, especially with Tashkent and Astana, are very important for us. And with that, I think I've spoken enough.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful pair of introductory presentations. The floor is open to questions first, because we really want to exploit our two guests here today to the maximum extent, and then later on, as the morning evolves, be more time for comments. Yes, please. Is there a mic? No. No mic. Just stand up if you would, please. Thanks. Yes, of course.
Hi, I'm David Sedney, former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. Got a question for each of you. Thank you. These were both insightful, and thank you, Fred, for doing this thing on Afghanistan, because I think it's really important. That's all that your two speakers have said. For Richard, I'd like to, if you could maybe perhaps go a little more into the issue that's of most currency in the area I used to work in, which is the alternative routes to Afghanistan through Central Asia, particularly through Uzbekistan, because of the Trump administration's much tougher on Pakistan than previous administrations. When I was in the government, we worked to create something called the Border Distribution Network. Had some successes, but foundered in many ways. Achieved full potential because of blockages from the Uzbek institutions and probably the Uzbek leadership. As we move into a new situation with Pakistan, what do you think of the possibilities that Uzbekistan might be more cooperative than has been in the past. There's this newness that you're talking about, is that going to extend to helping with the transportation issues of the past? Secondly, for John, while I agree with you about the continuity issue, I follow current events as I know you do, and of course there are lots of rumors, reports in some publications that Mr. Ilyakov is actually creating tensions and that there are serious problems in that broad leadership. And what would you say about the role of Mr. Ilyakov and the potential for a split in the Uzbek leadership?
Well, do you want to deal with that?
Sorry.
Hot one?
I heard somebody ask who is Mr. Ilyakov. Rustam Ilyakov is the head of the security services of Uzbekistan, has been since I believe 1985, and was often seen as the bulwark of President Karimov's power, and we'll talk more about it, of course, John knows.
First, something I might mention in my initial remarks. Uzbek politics are opaque.
Oh.
So, I can't rule out the possibility that these stories are true. All I can say definitively is that if they are true, they would fly in the face of Uzbek practice as we have seen it over substantial time. One of the reasons why I said and believe strongly that the Uzbek elite is cohesive is that there are no known examples of senior Uzbeks challenging leadership and winding up either dead, in jail, as opposed to under some form of mild house arrest, or in exile and pursued by Uzbek legal authorities. And that contrasts with other countries in the region, fairly substantial. And if you look at the transitions in Uzbek history, for example, to Karimov as the first secretary of the Uzbek Communist Party in the late 80s, he was an obscure governor in Kashkadarya when he was chosen. And again, the example we now had with Mirziyoyev. So there may well be some tensions involving Mr. Inoyatov, who was a powerful figure. He was considered, among people trying to figure out who would be the next president after Karimov, he was mentioned as a contender, as was, he was known as Big Rustam, and Little Rustam Azimov was considered the other contender. I was always skeptical about both of them. One, because Inoyatov, too powerful, too behind the scenes, would not be seen as the right figure publicly, and Rustam Azimov not quite strong enough in Uzbek context to be seen. Anyway, that's purely speculative.
You want to comment?
Just on the topic I know a little about, which is the distribution network. And I want to actually take the opportunity to thank you for all your work in that. Just to remind people what happened was the U.S. After September 11 terrorist attacks sending large contingency of forces into Afghanistan, as did NATO countries. To keep them supplied, we primarily rely on Pakistan, which sends supplies to Pakistani ports, and from which they're then brought overland into Afghanistan. But at various points, this supply was interrupted, sometimes by Pakistani actions, such as after there was border skirmishes and was Pakistani soldiers killed, sometimes by local obstacles, and sometimes by other bottlenecks. And so what the Obama administration did was a major achievement, was opening up another way in which we could supply our forces, which is through, at the time, through Russia, the Caucasus, into Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan. And that was a real achievement, making that work. Now, what happened is that over time, that the route faded in importance. The Pakistanis have stopped these kind of interruptions. The number of U.S. forces and NATO forces went down. And I'm sure that the military is keeping this contingency open, though, because of the tensions we have with Pakistan now. So far, the Pakistanis have not threatened to cut off. I mean, they get a lot of money from this. it could further reduce their leverage. I'm sure the Chinese are urging them not to secure the southern supply route. But I would think we would keep this open. But the challenges we're going to face, this option, is the same as in the past. One, the costs are a lot higher. It's cheaper to bring them in through Pakistan than to try and move them in overland. Two, I think the Russian government would be less supportive of these routes than it was at the time when the administration opened them. And three, even if we do this, we need to then make a greater effort, or I'm not sure why it didn't work, but there's an idea which we were going to expand outward from this initially military, especially non-lethal supply framework, to try and broaden it and to include other commercial ties, help build this north-south Silk Road transportation networks, and that really didn't take much effect. It didn't make that transition. So if we were to do that, it would be good if we could make another effort on that, since, as you mentioned, now we have a more positive Uzbek government on the question of regional transit. Especially this issue of if there's been discussions about reopening this between the two governments, I don't know. But this is just my speculation that I'm sure they're considering this option. And I think the Uzbeks would be receptive to reopening it.
Yes, please. Sir, you, and then next to you.
Hi, my name is Will Ward. I'm an independent consultant. I had a question about the One Belt, One Road Chinese policy in Central Asia. I'm not quite familiar, but it's my understanding that there is two different options that they're looking to kind of connect Eurasia, at least through Kazakhstan. And where I'm getting at is, if China, and Kazakhstan, and everyone who's involved in the actual project looks to go south towards Shymkent, what kind of buy-in and what kind of relationship needs to be forged between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, especially with the Mirziyoyev administration kind of getting on board and kind of trying to build stronger ties within the region?
Okay, I think the Chinese have been eclectic and comprehensive in their efforts to build these ties. So they seem to be exploring all sorts of routes through Russia, through Kazakhstan, through others, particularly through Pakistan, on through and Afghanistan is now being swept in this, as is Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. Certainly, this is the thing that seems to be, of course, come into play is how receptive local governments are, but also a lot of costs. That's, for example, challenged the idea of the Kyrgyz route, the China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Afghan railroad in the past. One of the more recent proposals was that the railroads wouldn't stop in Kyrgyzstan, just go through it, and the Kyrgyz government, for understandable reasons, is objected to this, and now try and revise it so that there would be some local benefit. And this is the challenge that the Chinese and the local governments are facing. The Chinese interest in this is clear. With the land route, you can save a lot of cost and time and some goods. But the Central Asian countries don't want to be just transit zones for this. They want to have it so that there would be off-road, so in ways in which the local communities can benefit, in which they can be involved. And I think that's something where I think good U.S. diplomacy could perhaps contribute. I think that the U.S. has good niche assets in how to promote these kind of local entrepreneurs and so on. But so that's where I think I know the Uzbek government is pretty enthusiastic though about the possible opportunities for building infrastructure and so on, providing that the interests of their nationals and others are met.
Yes, please.
Kathy Cosman. I have a couple of related questions. One international organization you did not mention is the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and what Uzbekistan's role in that is and attitude towards the organization. The other is somewhat related to that, and that is the status of the Uzbek minorities, especially in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. I understand there have been many problems, to put it mildly, for all three of them in different ways. And then, of course, there's the problem with the Tajik minority in Uzbekistan. And finally, and this is perhaps the largest question, you mentioned, of course, the question of extremist groups and how the Uzbek government is dealing with that. But it seems to me that until they reform their religion law, which has put many thousands of totally peaceful Muslims, independent Muslims, in jail, sort of like they're not really dealing with the problem.
The last issue is the subject of a paper that's coming out. They, as you know, they have released several thousand people. So in a sense, the question is where you're going now in the future. That paper will be in the book. We're not going to have a session on it. At least we haven't planned it now, but if there's a desire to have a special session on it, we'd be glad to do so.
Yeah, the OSCE, I had problems with actually getting it to turn on all the regional organizations. I mean, even EU, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, NATO, CSIS, the OSCE, and there are a couple others. The focus of Uzbek diplomacy hasn't been on these. It's been more on the bilateral or multilateral, but outside some of these institutions. So there hasn't been much on it. I know that they made some comments about the elections that took place in Uzbekistan that wanted some changes. I know that they, of course, because they're so active, I have one of their baskets is some of the questions you've mentioned, the religious freedom and the question of minorities. I think that the minority issue you can talk about, because I think that's one of the targets and perhaps one of the opportunities coming out of this engagement is that in the past the government would prioritize its national security to the extent that it was cutting off ties with the minority groups that happen to be located across the border. It was much more concerned about border security, someone's borders were mine, and that presented problems for families and communities that were, just happened to find themselves split apart by arbitrary Soviet borders. The new government's approach is to relax these visa restrictions, be much more open about direct and indirect transit. I know that in the case of Kyrgyzstan, they're now allowing people to visit for Uzbekistan, not just for funerals, but actually visit families. And so they're expanding the number of short-range visits. And this is, I think will help alleviate the problem. Where it's still going to be a challenge ahead mostly is, I think, in the 15% of the Kyrgyz Uzbek border that hasn't been delineated. You've got some really complicated enclaves, and so you're going to have to move populations or allow, promote much more further border relaxation or something to resolve those. But I think in this area for Kyrgyzstan, there's been a lot of progress in trying to enhance ethnic contacts between groups that are just separated by what were at the Soviet period administrative borders.
Any further questions, comments? Yes, sir. Right here. And then over.
Thank you, Scott Koenig, who's very much a non-essential Hill staffer. In Uzbekistan, how far can this go? How far can the reform process go? And does this cohesive elite have a cohesive vision of where they want this process to put them?
Want to start?
I think I've not looked at the domestic reform process. I'm going to come to that.
I left Uzbekistan working for the State Department in July of 2003. I went back for the first time this past November. I was in both Samarkand and Tashkent. I had a chance to talk to some well-connected people. One of them, who is considered a reformer, said to me, not only that this process began while Karimov was still alive, but that we should not expect too much and certainly not too fast. And I think that's right. I think it'll be, in the first instance, an economic reform, and also some movement on human rights issues, as the release of prisoners suggest. I would put true democracy, true open society decades away. I would say if things turned out well, we'll see a gradual easing of restrictions on economic activity, a diminished role, although not that diminished, for the state. And if these things yield prosperity, we'll see more of it, and perhaps the tempo will will pick up. My sense from my time in Tashkent, so we're going back now 16 years, 17 years, is that the main issue of that day, which remains a very important issue, which is truly making the sum a freely convertible currency, was something the president was willing to consider seriously, but some of those entrenched elites, again, elite politics, not so much. So this opening to work has to reflect a broader consensus. And again, I think it'll be slow and no guarantees, but for the moment they're heading in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks for the good presentations. My name is Dick Oakland. I have a slightly broader question. I'm going to ask you to look ahead a little bit. You've both done a wonderful job of going behind the scenes on details, growing cooperation in the region, water issues, for example, lines of communication, trade, delineation of borders, things like that. But looking ahead, historically, it's always been hard for Kazakhstan, or for Central Asia, to work together as a bloc because of the big egos of Karimov and Nazarbayev for a good 20 plus years. Now that's changing. In March, in fact, there'll be a head of state meeting. There'll be C5, not +1, C5 in Kazakhstan. So looking ahead, what do you see as the future of regional cooperation? If you have any thoughts on that, please.
Sure. I think you put it exactly right. In the past, there have been the level of regional cooperation at the economic and security humanitarian level has been suboptimal. I mean, a bunch of reasons for that. A bunch of reasons for that. I mean, Soviet legacy, lack of infrastructure, priority of internal security as opposed to regional integration, concern about being manipulated by foreign powers, and so on. Now, the Kazakhs have always been enthusiastic about increasing cooperation among Central Asians, but in the past, the Korean administration was perhaps the main barrier. But that appears to be changing, as you said, and it's certainly in the interest of, this is where I got the suboptimal from, because economically, the economists say if we can increase, reduce a lot of the trade barriers between them, increase mutual investment, give a larger market to perhaps foreign companies, you can result in a lot of benefits economically. Politically and security-wise, if the Central Asians can come closer together, coordinate their diplomacy, as they've now said they will try and do in regional organization, to enhance their leverage with other players, particularly Russia, China, and the U.S. So the incentives are all there, and you've now got some of the obstacles being removed. So I think that the trends look positive. It does depend a bit on what the role the outside powers play. It depends a bit on what happens in Kazakhstan going forward. But certainly, as you said, you've got new possibilities here.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Nahal Mamlo from the Voice of America. President Mirziyoyev wants to fundamentally change the way government works. That's what we hear from him on a daily basis nowadays. He wants to fully reform the foreign ministry. He wants to fully reform the National Security Service that we just mentioned here. How tough is that going to be in your view? Ambassador Herbst, you have worked in Uzbekistan, you have dealt with both the foreign ministry and definitely the National Security Service. The question that we hear a lot, not just outside of Uzbekistan, but inside the country now too, is that, how much support base does President Mirziyoyev have? Does he have enough to push this through? Because he sounds incredibly ambitious, and he sounds that he wants to, he wants to make sure that the government serves the people. That's what we hear from him on a day-to-day basis. Any suggestions, any advice, any insights on how difficult this is going to be?
I'm going to offer a tentative response because I have not read enough of the Uzbek media over the past year to offer a more confident response. I believe there's a slight disconnect between the rhetoric about transformation and the actual policies that are being proposed. So there is a great deal of enthusiasm about turning the country around. That's reflected also in a hyperactive, actually I shouldn't use the word hyper, in a highly active governing style, which is putting somewhat of inert bureaucrats on their toes, which is a good thing. So that's on the one side. On the other, when you look at the concrete things that are being discussed for change, they're a little bit less than the overall tone. Now that's not necessarily a problem, and that may be the answer to your question. I just don't feel fully confident to say yes, it's definitely right.
Yes, please, and back? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Laura Jewett from the National Democratic Institute. Thank you for the presentation. And I have a question that's a little bit the flip side of the question just asked. Do you have a sense of where there may be red lines where government officials or representatives of society cannot go at this point?
On foreign policy. The broader issue is a huge,
Yes.
let's focus first at least on that. Doesn't exclude the.
Right, foreign policy I can answer, which is, I mean, so far you've got still reaffirmation of the traditional red lines that we've seen in recent years in usually foreign policy. It's not a break so much from the new administration, which is, there will be, Uzbekistan is not going to join foreign military alliances. It's not going to host foreign military bases on a permanent basis. It's not going to allow Uzbek soldiers to serve in outside Uzbek territory. Basically the foreign policy concept of 2002 or 2012 maybe, and the recent presidential statements and strategy, there really is difference in these red lines. You see a lot of changes in emphasizing cooperation at regional level, changing tone and so on, but those are still those fundamental principles persist. They may change, but for now, I've not seen any indication that they will.
Does anyone here want to comment more generally on red lines beyond foreign policy, very briefly? Oh, come on, we have a lot of competence in this room. Don, would you like to? The broader dimension of your question.
First, let me make one point on the foreign policy side. The changes there are, I believe, significant. I think President Karimov had more difficult relations with his neighbors than Uzbekistan required. And I think that's understood by the current leadership in Tashkent. And so I think those are going to last for a long time. On the domestic side, I think the answer to the question is implicit in what I've already said. We're going to see no major creation of an open society. We're not going to see a free media anytime, truly free media anytime soon. We may see some tentative steps towards more open and quasi-independent political activity. May. But a truly open political culture where you have independent political parties is not going to happen, certainly in the next few years. So these things can be expected.
Yes, well, no, first here, please.
Hi, my name's Franny Balfinet. I used to work for an
Excuse me,
organization.
we have a mic.
Oh, I used to work for an organization called Caritas of West Siberia. I also used to be Mr. Weitz's intern, Dr. Weitz's intern. And my knowledge of Central Asia and the Central Asians that we work with just displayed crushing poverty. And you say that Central Asia, Mr. Herbst, has it's achieved stability. What's the mechanism for that stability? How has it achieved that in spite of what seemed to me, to my knowledge, the crushing poverty of Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tajiks?
Stability comes, you might say, from at least two important sources. One is I hesitate to say political, I would say a sociological or socio-political, socio-economic culture which understands the importance of certain modes of behavior, of a certain amount, this will seem strange, but we can argue about this, certain amount of tolerance, and that in itself is one important wellspring of the stability. The other, and this is what I had in mind when I made those comments initially, whatever their failings, the leaders of the Central Asian countries were not interested in violence as a means to take advantage one of the other. Even before President Karimov departed this life, Uzbekistan had arranged peacefully many of its border questions with its neighbors. And while there are inter-ethnic tensions in Central Asia, they were always kept within very reasonable bounds. Again, because leaders across the region understood the importance of that. Now, you're right, there is serious poverty in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and even parts of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. There have also, with the exception of Kazakhstan, been very poor economic policy making in all those countries. But the stability is real, and even in light of the much vaunted, but always rather limited, danger of Islamic extremism. And actually, that's an important point I should have mentioned initially. The Islam has been practiced in Central Asia for centuries, and Islam arrived in Central Asia in the 8th century. And some of the greatest scholars and qadis of Islamic history came from what is now the territory of Uzbekistan. It was always a very moderate brand of Islam. And the extremists arrived with the promotion of Salafi Islam coming from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, more like the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, and to a certain extent, Pakistan, and even India.
I'd be a little careful with, I know I say this all the time too, but there are some cautions. Mahmud of Ghazni, the great specialist in pillage and rape, his name is not associated with moderation. And he's from Kyrgyzstan.
But he was not an Islamic scholar, he was a leader.
He was a leader,
Right.
but this became the dominant, for a key century, it became the dominant ideology, if you will, and led to the demise of the culture that you're talking about.
What time period are we talking about?
And the point, which is valid, is that over the long haul, the Hanafi school of law, even though if you read its actual provisions, has some very tough stuff in it, it nonetheless is relatively more open to business and commerce, and relatively more open to resolution of conflict through calm and rational means than the other school. And they are within the other schools, and within the region, there's great pride in this fact, which is a reality.
And especially the Hanbali school has been a source of most of the Salafis come from that school. Anyway, the practice of Islam in the historic territory of Central Asia is by and large, in terms of its doctrine, been moderate. And again, the great qadis come from Central Asia.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed. Thank you from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Mr. Herbst, earlier we were talking about some minors in the Uzbek policy locally and domestically. Foreign affairs speaking minors that might not happen in a couple of years, decade, whatever. So, what is that? If you can be specific with it, what is that which is stopping Mirziyoyev from handling these minors? That includes human rights, media, or some of the issues that you mentioned earlier.
Again, you know, the starting of wisdom for policymakers or analysts is understanding a country's history or a region's history and culture. And it's at best myopic to assume that the practices that we developed here, and by here I mean the United States, but maybe also Western Europe, over centuries, are practices that will be transplanted in regions which had a very different history and culture, and practices will be transplanted in the space of even decades. So it's, to me, it's very, very egotistical is not the right word. I'm losing the word I was trying to find. I can't find the word I'm searching for. In any case, you're assuming that your culture is the only way to go, and it can be moved quickly around the world. That's simply not possible. We have 15 years of foreign policy, or 87 years of foreign policy, which demonstrate that, at great cost to us.
I wonder, can I call on you for, how does this look from the standpoint of Afghanistan as a neighbor? And not even as a neighbor, maybe as a full member of the region.
Thank you. I'm Rob Swan here with John Hopkins and also Asian Development Bank, but my comments will be personal. In terms of regional cooperation, I believe Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, especially with the new government, the cooperation has increased. The visits of presidents and officials. In the last few weeks, we have lots of senior officials from Uzbekistan visiting Afghanistan, from Afghanistan visiting Uzbekistan, and there will be in February a regional cooperation meeting in Uzbekistan. So I think in that aspect, from that aspect, that's a very positive move. And there will be a railway, the discussion of connecting Uzbekistan will be to Herat, to Iran, and all the way to further down from Iran to Chabahar and India's access. This is something that recently has been emphasized, and I think they are building on that. But in terms of security, I think with what's happening recently, with Russia's announcement of some sort of or assumption around that Russia is supporting the Taliban, and then the foreign minister of Russia's comment, and then the U.S. ambassadors in Kabul's reaction to that, and of course, Pakistan is next door. These are the implications that I was also wondering, what do you think, just throwing back the question, but how that broader global challenges, Russia and U.S. Competition involve Uzbekistan, and what would be Uzbekistan's response to that? That's something that may or may not impact the regional cooperation and economic activity. So perhaps another question throwing back.
Thank you. At this point, let me open the floor not just to questions, but to comments like the one you just heard. Yes, please.
Laura Kennedy, and I have Laura Kennedy, and I have on and off experience with Central Asia through almost 40 years with the State Department. I had sort of a bit of a comment and also a question. But in terms of regional integration, I think Ambassador Herbst referred at one point to the interests of some of the elites in impediments to greater integration, such as the full convertibility of the sum. And I know that certainly we always used to look at decisions at the capital, the elite level, when we would try as the U.S. government to enhance regional cooperation, particularly economic and so on. But also, I'm thinking about impediments to regional integration, economic cooperation at local infrastructure levels. I think a lot of people believe that it was in the interest of, say, local border guards, local officials to have lots of regulations because you could sort of supplement your meager salaries by getting bribes to then circumvent all these regulations. So I guess my comment is, to what extent do you think this sort of inbuilt issue is an impediment to greater integration? And related to that is corruption. Is the new government doing more on the corruption, fighting corruption, whether it be at the top or at the local level? So that's my sort of comment question, and also wanted to ask him about Iran. I think, again, John alluded to Iran obliquely at one point. Thank you.
I'll go with the Iran one. That's the one I know better. The Iran relationships with all those countries has improved, as has Iran's relation, particularly with Russia, and that's helping drive forward. Iran in principle is an opportunity for Central Asia as a means by which they can gain access to world markets through the Persian Gulf. But that relationship has always been limited by fears that Iran will try and export its version of, its vision of Islam to a region which is, as Ambassador Herbst and Starr said, it's not really native to that region for the most part to have that kind of radical theocratic government. There has been more recently concerns about the sanctions, Western Iranian tensions. You saw those weakening under the late Obama administration. There was a lot of discussion about new opportunities, perhaps elevating Iran's status from being an observer to a full member of the China Cooperation Organization. But as we know, during the past year, that process has been reversed, and I think that as long as Iran's relations with the United States remain so troubled, as well as competition that Iran faces in the region of Saudi Arabia and other governments are active, there's a limited willingness of the local governments to involve, to develop joint economic and security structures with Iran. So that's one area where I thought a year ago there might be more changes, but because of how things have worked out between the U.S. and Iran primarily, that their relationship appears to be pretty not changing that much. I think there's been some oil agreements, for example, with Uzbekistan, but nothing fundamentally changed Iran's separation from the bulk of what's going on in Central Asia.
Okay, I think the problem of corruption in Central Asia, as in many regions, is exceptionally difficult. I believe that it's possible for there to be individual reforms that will impinge upon, even substantially damage, certain vested interests. And that would happen, for example, if you wind up having a truly convertible soon. But I think addressing corruption head-on overall is a project of decades in Central Asia. That said, if you have certain, corruption remains a substantial problem in Kazakhstan, yet it has not stopped major economic development. I think the same is true in Uzbekistan if they open things up. And that over time will generate interest which will counterbalance those vested interests. And with that, I apologize, I've got to run.
Let me just add that one of our other papers will be addressing this, or several of them be addressing this question of corruption. And very interestingly, it will, thank you so much, John. Very interestingly, the effort is to engage the local public as watchdogs on the local administrations. This is one of the key themes. It's extremely powerful stuff being done. How it works out in practice is yet to be seen. But the idea that anyone can address any official at any time and that he must be able to respond via email very quickly, that's about as frontal a threat as you can make. We'll see what happens. Yes, you were going to comment?
Yes, sorry. It's a comment regarding, you mentioned China and your Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the things that struck me in dealing with the area is while the elites and the governing elites of the countries involved are generally really positive about the various infrastructure projects proposed by the Chinese under the Belt and Road Initiative, at a popular level, the Chinese are not popular. In fact, there's a great deal of resentment at the popular level in almost all of these countries, and including Uzbekistan, against China for a variety of things, from cheap consumer goods that are in place, perceived methods of behavior of Chinese government officials and corporations. So I was just suggesting, as you look at that in the future, that divide between the government and the people on the value of that Belt and Road Initiative might be an area to look at.
Yes, please, in fact.
Thank you. Sebastian Leroux, Central Asia Program, George Washington University. I have a quick question to Richard. Islam Karimov was extremely reluctant to talk about the problem of migrants, of Uzbek migrants, those working in Russia and Kazakhstan. It seems that Mirziyoyev is much more open to the question, really open to address this problem. We've seen that he tried to negotiate a little bit with Kazakhstan and Russia. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What kind of impact this has on Uzbekistan foreign policy? Thank you.
Good point. I think you're right. I think that the issue came up particularly in the presidential summit in Moscow in April, where that's become an issue. I think it's going to have some influence over the Uzbek policy towards Commonwealth of independent states, particularly the Eurasian Economic Union. And even going to the Chinese Silk Road, one of the opportunities I think that the Uzbek administration is considering is if you can expand Uzbekistan's role as a labor provider to the kind of joint initiatives you're going to have in the region. So I agree it's become more a priority, at least at the very step. I think there was a new agreement between Russia and Uzbekistan on this issue that was signed to strictly address it. So I think that's where we are with that.
Good. Well, we're beginning to impinge on your lunch, and therefore I'm going to close our session, but with a couple of quick observations first. If there's one theme that dominates all others in the area of foreign policy, it's regional. They've been very utterly clear about this, that the region is their first priority. And this is something dramatic and new. And of course, for it to be your first priority, effectively means that you have to have your neighbors in agreement. And immense amount of effort has gone into that. I've met in the last 4 months with 4 of the presidents and all six of the prime ministers, I'm counting Afghanistan as part of the deal, and all of them, for the time being, are very enthusiastic about this. Whether this will endure, this enthusiasm will endure, will be interesting to watch. Now, on terminology, this is very important. Are we talking about, is this regionalism directed towards some integration? Actually, no one uses that term. They use cooperation, collaboration, coordination, all sorts of words that are that protect sovereignty. So the idea, for the time being, we'll see how it works out, is to build a kind of second floor on the structure of sovereignty that's been created in the last 25 years, not to do something that would in the end dilute it. Now, beyond that, a word about the issue of cohesion. It would be embarrassing to republish a collection of prognosis on the succession issues in Central Asia, because where it was expected to be smooth and harmonious, it has often not been, and where it was expected to be conflictual, it has proven not to be. I would submit that one of the factors you're dealing with here is deep culture. And that is that it's a bit of a trite thing to say, but Uzbekistan is fundamentally an oasis culture. And an oasis culture is organized around the extraordinarily complex demands of maintaining irrigated agriculture. And those are deeply technological. I mean, the fact that cities in this region 1,000 years ago could have 7,000 people on their payroll to maintain the hydraulic systems, the irrigation systems, means that this created very much a political culture based on hierarchy, top-down control, and discipline. And maybe what we've seen in this transition is the effect of that. If that's the case, then one wants to ask, well, how might it be in Kazakhstan, where you have a very different, more horizontal political culture? These are questions worth speculating on. But I come back to what John Herbst said. I think we have seen a dramatic example of cohesion. The question is, will this cohesion extend on a regional basis, and how enduring will it be? Now, if I can add a further thing, I think the context of everything we've discussed is worth focusing on for a minute. Reforms are very different when you do them out of strength versus weakness. And it is true that there are all kinds of pathologies in Uzbekistan and the Uzbek economy. These are no secret. They're talking about them every day now. They're there, they've been there. On the other hand, according to those of you who have attended our briefings that we hold twice a year with the International Monetary Fund, and they're pretty sober people. I mean, their clear conclusion is that they're entering this age of reform on the basis of strength, not of weakness. Whether you accept their official or the IMF's official 8% growth, or drop back to a mere 6 or something like that, it's still strength. And that changes, I would submit, the context. And the growths, in short-term growths, Mamuka Tsereteli will be writing about this in his chapter, and he'll be reporting to this group about it, I hope soon. But the dramatic and sharp increases of trade, for example, with Kazakhstan, suggest that actually some of these things might have a positive impact on the economy that might help a positive trajectory, but that remains to be seen. I think a further thing that I want to stress here is that this regionalism is truly shared by the leadership in every country. Now, to be sure, in every country there are zealots who are not enthused about it, but by and large, this is something they realize, that if we don't link arms, outsiders can play a divide and conquer game on us. And so this is why you have the unlikely partnerships of Ashraf Ghani and Mr. Berdi Muhamedov and so on. These are people who are coming together. And the meeting which Dick Hoagland referred to in March, interestingly, it was called by the Uzbeks. And of the five presidents, they will add a sixth, by the way, Afghanistan. That's their clear intention. But that meeting was called by the Uzbeks. It's being held in Astana. So you have the two power centers that are absolutely cooperating on the regionalism. And just to conclude on this theme, this is not from the Uzbek side, but it directly affects the prospects of this aspiration. A year and a half ago, President Nazarbayev was asked in a semi-public setting, and then it was made public, what does he think about all this? And he said, well, you know, the Russians keep talking about greater Eurasia. And he said, I have a lot of maps at home and I can't find this on any map. And he said, what I do know, and I'm quoting him verbatim, is that there is a Central Asia, that Central Asia includes Afghanistan, and always has, and that, here's the key, that we have common interests, common understanding, common psychology, common culture, and finally, a wonderful line, he said, we know each other far better than outsiders know us. It's a very interesting observation, and again, where this leads, we can't say. We don't know. There are a lot of very big unknowns. Mr. Lavrov's comments just last week, very suspicious of the U.S.'s C5+1, which will probably become a C6. Very suspicious of it, saying, this is some American scheme to drive us out of Central Asia and to introduce some greater Central Asia. You know, he went on and on in this vein. But in fact, the Russians haven't come up with an official response to this. They've been polite, they've been correct so far, with this one exception. And I think they truly are still pondering it. So that's a huge unknown. The Europeans will move very quickly because they've been very proactive in the last few years. The Chinese seem pretty comfortable with it so far. There's no statements that we've come across that that reflect skepticism. But all these things are unknowns. And the biggest unknown is the Newtonian question, and that is, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And will there be a Newtonian response to this, either within Uzbekistan or more broadly, or within the international community? All I can say on that is two things. First, stay in touch with our project. Mamuka will be the next person speaking on the Uzbek economy, and we'll be covering everything else, including religious issues. Svante Cornell and a colleague will do that. Stay in touch with that, and broadly speaking, stay tuned, because this region, I couldn't agree more with what's been said about the importance of it. But it's also, by golly, it happens to be very interesting now. So it's worth your attention, and it'll reward your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard.